Okay, so now we're going to investigate behaviorism. And one of the older and very, it seemed effective at the time, schools of psychology, the behaviorists. Behaviorism is the psychological conditioning of observable behavior. So, to begin with, we're going to talk about Pavlov and his dog. But before we get to that, we have to look that behaviorists are only concerned with things that they can observe. The mind is unimportant because it cannot be observed. Now, probably the extreme opposite of behaviorists, people that are focused in on behavior and only things that are observable and testable at the time. And we have to also put this in context. Before the 1960s, when behaviorists were really popular, they were in fact unable to see what the mind was doing. And we were still using structuralist, functionalist approaches where you're asking people what they're thinking. Now, cognitive psychologists really don't care for behaviorism. Cognitive psychologists are very much based on the functional structural ideas that you could see that the brain is moving in certain parts and how it works, and that the consequence is the behavior of the thought. But we talk about what creatures exhibit behavior without thinking about it. We have to think about animals outside of humans. Humans have a cognitive understanding and they think about things and they determine their actions. Now, the complete opposite of behaviorism is what we just talked about before, would be psychoanalysis or psychodynamics. And Sigmund Freud. Freud is focused solely on the unconscious mind and the conscious mind. And he thinks, almost 90% of your mind is unconscious. You're not, but it's this battle you're having with the world, and your superego is the good guy that's trying to be the society, and that's Alfred trying to act proper, and your bodily wants and desires are fighting each other. And there's all this stuff going on in your mind, and sometimes it slips out in Freudian slips, or your behavior comes out. Well, with the behaviorist, they would say, that's all nonsense. Who cares what's happening in your mind? The only thing that matters is what behavior you do, and if we could change the behavior physically outside the body, using things like punishment or consequences. And we talked about, like, one big example of behaviorist approach is the way you see something like grades. I think students get really tied up and they see grades almost as like punishment, or they see it as a reward. Well, that's not the point of grades. However, especially in the pandemic, when we were, virtual, and you guys didn't even see or interact with me, I noticed that students were emailing me all the time about grades because we almost had no relationship or almost not human beings to each other. And I just seemed like a guy that taught the course. And it was grades, 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 and grades and more grades, because that was something they could actually see and seemed not abstract, but something that was real to them. And that's what mattered. Well, now I could see you guys in the classroom a lot more, and you could see that you're doing some things because you enjoy them. And there's a lot of other things that are motivating your behavior outside of just the grade itself. And most teachers are trying to get you to learn. We want you to learn to be a better person. And we're not always so concerned with your grade. Your grade is feedback on how you're doing, so that if you have an A, you have an exceptional job. And if you don't have an A, you're not doing a B, you might be proficient. But A, you're advanced and you really know what you're talking about. And C is you got a basic understanding. And then a D would be below basic. And F obviously is really below basic. You have almost very limited understanding, if any. So that's why we have grades. But Freud and the psychoanalysts are getting attacked by the behaviorists. And this is all going to start with Ivan Pavlov. Now, Pavlov really is the father of behaviorism, if you want to call him that. He starts it all off. He's a Russian physiologist, actually. He's very scientific in his approach. And the Russians start this behaviorist school, which is going to really be picked up by the Americans later. And what he does is he creates a successful experiment that proves that you can classically condition a dog. Now, classical conditioning is when the conditioned stimulus, a sound of a metronome, it was actually a metronome. Everybody says it's a bell. And we go, that's why I like this joke. Pavlov. That name rings a bell. Come on, it's good. Is paired with an unconditional stimulus, the taste of food. So, what happened is, and this is pure accidents or serendipity or chance, What happened is Pavlov comes into his room and he was working with dogs doing other experiments, and he sees that he would feed the dogs and the dogs would start salivating. And he notices that, and that's natural. Humans salivate too when it's time to eat. But then something happened, and that really made him think. He came in the room, and he didn't have food, and the dogs were salivating. They're drooling, their saliva's falling all over the floor. And he's going, what the heck? I don't have any food. It's not time to eat. What had happened is the dogs had been conditioned that they associated Dr. Pavlov with food. So time to eat. So their mind, and not even necessarily thinking about, starts producing saliva to prepare to eat. And he's like, I got an idea. What if I take a metronome, which is like musicians use them. You might not know what that is. And a metronome goes. If you've ever seen them, so that you could count 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, you could keep your timing when you're playing an instrument. So that's why most people say it's a bell today. But he uses metronome to make and play that sound when he brought food out. And we're for the sake of time, we're just gonna pretend it was a bell. So he's ringing the bell, ding 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 ding, ding, and here's the food. Ding 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 ding, here's the food. Ding 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 ding, here's the food. Then he goes, food. Or he goes, ding ding ding, no food. Guess what the dogs did? The same thing as when they saw Dr. Pavlov. They start salivating and they're ready to eat. You guys might start salivating at certain times a day if you get conditioned by when we eat. If you eat like the same time every day, like if you eat 11 o'clock lunch at school every day, you might start actually producing more saliva right around 11 o'clock because your body is getting ready to help you eat and digest your food and break down the food with your saliva. So this is a big deal. He learns that a conditioned stimulus, which is conditioned means that you're actually trying to condition them or shape the behavior, paired with an unconditional stimulus. So stimulus is just something you see, hear, or taste. But in this case, it's food. When paired with food, and when you see food, you start salivating. But pair the food with the metronome or the bell, boom, you could take the stimulus away and still get the same results because you made such a strong association through behaviorism. Now, and this gets really questionable, and the Russians get a lot of, and you can see this in the picture, they get really, some big questions are asked about the way the Russians attack and approach psychology, and Americans as well. The Russians are pretty ends justify the means in their psychology. Like, they really get into behaviorism, and they start doing things, as you can see in the picture. This boy has basically a saliva catching machine or bottle. It drilled a hole in his cheek so he could see if they could do this to humans. And this is obviously considered very unethical and immoral today. But at this time, there really weren't true national or universal standards or international standards on what was ethical. And psychology was getting better and better at changing behavior. And we're going to find that even in America, we've had issues with psychology, especially like things like splitting identical twins and having them adopted by different families. And universities in America have done that. So here's a little apparatus catching the saliva. They wanted to be more scientific about the experiment. But I think a lot of people have a problem with putting holes in people's bodies to do experiments and treating them like an animal to this point, and maybe even doing that to animals. Now, the next experiment is where we start to get into questionable practices. But we do learn something, whether you want it or not. John Watson does a famous experiment based on Pavlov's, and he says, look, if you could do this with dogs, we could do it with human beings. So he's going to apply Pavlov's experiment to humans. And what he sees is he creates this experiment, and they call the boy Albert. And we don't know his real name. We think we figured it out maybe about 10, 15 years ago. But we're not still 100% sure who the boy was. So he's protecting the subject. And it was like one of his coworkers or friends' kids. And he takes a 9-month-old boy, a little guy. And what he does is he calls him Albert B. And he puts a white rat, is usually what you hear the example. But they actually did a lot of things like beards, stuff, fluffy animals. all kinds of white, fluffy objects and soft objects. They put it in front of the boy, and a natural 9-year-old boy or 9-month-old boy, because of curiosity, will start playing with the objects and will have fun and get a lot of joy out of it. So, what they wanted to do is the unconditioned response is having fun playing with. They want to see if they could shape the behavior, if they could change the boy's behavior, and him enjoying playing with these objects. And this is where it gets really questionable. And actually, it gets pretty serious. Some of these guys, like Watson, you can see in the bottom, he says, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and many in a specific world in which to bring them up. And I guarantee I'll take any one of the random kids and become some kind of type of specialist." He was convinced that he could raise people to be doctors and lawyers and artists, merchant chiefs, and yes, even beggarmen as thieves, regardless of takers, tendencies, abilities, vocations, race of his ancestors. So he was convinced that he could even change and they could condition people through behaviorism to be good or bad people. And we're seeing actually the Nazis believe this as well, and some other questionable groups. So what happened is after the boy was comfortable playing with these, as you can see, this little white fluffy rat, or the rabbit. There's a rabbit they're playing with too. They would start making a loud banging sound, almost like cymbals, like ching. Have you ever seen cymbals in an orchestra? Ching, and he would take like a piece of metal and bang it with a hammer, bang, 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 which is like a really scary sound. So the unconditional response of the child was when you bang, you hit the metal with the hammer, is they're going to go, they're going to cry. Because kids are scared of loud sounds. That's just how babies are designed. And humans adults are as well. Well, by putting this conditioned response, which is the banging the hammer, with an unconditioned response, fear, and by showing, and they were behind the boy, so the boy didn't see them. The boy is only seeing like the rabbit, or the white rats, or people say, and he sees these little animals and these objects that were once a source of joy and curiosity, and it became a trigger of fear. Because every time they had these toys, and you could see these pictures are horrible, trying to scare this little baby, they would have these white fluffy animals or bunnies and fluffy creatures, bang, bang, and it would scare the heck out of this kid. And what happened in the end is it worked too well. They had basically created a phobia, which is a fear. And in this case, the fear was of fluffy things. So the boy may have been even afraid of Santa Claus and had other fears up until probably maybe the end of his life. They had created a phobia. And this really raises questions about the ethics of behaviorism. Is this right to do this to children's behavior? Should we be doing things like this? Should we be triggering fear? And this is absolutely groundbreaking, though, because it proved it works, and that we can shape children's behavior. But on the other side of it, it was very devastating, because what they did to the subject, the kid, Albert, may not ever been reversed.